Worldview-Agility podcast. Hello and welcome. My name is Carsten Ohrmann. Many thanks for tuning in. This episode is part of an entire series of conversations I've had with fellow curators of the Galileo Commission. The mission and the goal of the Galileo Commission is to expand the scope of science. It's about catalyzing a currently ongoing scientific revolution, which will result in reframing our existing knowledge on who and what we really are. I am one of the curators of the Galileo Commission myself, and I admire my colleagues for taking the time to engage in a conscious conversation. In this episode, I speak to Marjorie Woollacott. Marjorie is a former professor of human physiology and a member of the Institute of Neuroscience at the University of Oregon. She's also the president of the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Science and research director for the International Association of Near-Death Studies. We speak about the nature of consciousness from a neuroscientist perspective, what it would need to shift to a post-materialistic society, the role of the worldview and the rolling eyes threshold, and the fact that consciousness doesn't need a brain. We've recorded that session on the 4th of March 2022. And now, enjoy listening. I'm so thrilled that we have the opportunity to speak, and thanks for just sort of accepting that.
I mean, for all of us, I think when you find people that are like-minded, it's just fun to share and explore. So it's like, why wouldn't we want to do that? It's great.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really admire this. And this curator session was really just another kind of, oh, great new people, right? So did you already know a couple of them before? Obviously.
Well, yes, so I'm on the steering group along with David Lorimer and Vasily, and I think Athena and Joan are the other ones that are on it for the Galileo Commission. And he asked me to do that, I guess, about a year and a half ago. You know, I'm not sure why. David Lorimer is also a mystery to me in that I think we were introduced because I became the president of the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Sciences when my colleague Gary Schwartz said, hey, my research on mediumship is way too out there. I need like a solid neuroscientist to take my place as the president so we don't seem so weird. And I said, hey, I'll do it if you meet with me every week so that I can like have a team member. And then he drops out after a couple of months and here I am. And so what I end up doing is I adopt David Lorimer as my helper, my team member for being the president of my society. And so that's why we're creating this, editing this book. I had an idea because in the AAPS, we want to edit books quite regularly related to the primacy of consciousness. And I thought, since I'm the president and I needed to like lead the group, I wanted to have a book of the essays of scientists and academics about their spiritual awakening and their transformation, because we see those things in the general public, but we think, oh, scientists, no, they don't believe that. And so I wanted to have a book. I think we got about 55 people to go ahead and write these beautiful essays of how they were awakened spiritually and then how that transformed their lives. And so David was willing to like help me like navigate that project through all the invitations and now getting it published. So he's wonderful.
Interesting. So this is an interesting concept. So these people have been sort of, they have been enlightened, whatever they have got their spiritual kind of experiences. Do you think that this is as a result of their scientific work or independent from their scientific work?
You know, I think for most of them, it was independent, and yet what happened is that often they were spontaneous. I mean, I remember, so one of them was a quantum physicist graduate student. I think he was at Berkeley. And he went down, I think he's originally from Italy, but he went down to Mexico for a vacation for 2 weeks. And in the midst of this, being in Mexico, he has this amazing awakening, like, you know, I mean, the unit of awareness, et cetera, et cetera. And he comes back to his work and he stays with it for a while, but after a few years, he realizes that he's not going to answer the questions he wants at Berkeley as a professor in quantum physics. And he ends up moving to another area of work in his life. And I found that in either people change careers or they learn to incorporate this new way of being into their current career. And it was interesting to see how each one happened.
Yeah, I find this fascinating because conceptually, I also think that is true. I think there is a purely scientific path which basically leads to an intellectual kind of understanding that we actually live probably in a world which is slightly different than what we have been taught in school. But this is just a sort of intellectual, rational kind of conclusion pathway, right? And then you have got this all of a sudden these awakening moments that people have, right? And I think the way I look at this is one is sort of intellectual knowing, and the other is more sort of emotional and spiritual experiencing, right? And I think sometimes people have that spiritual awakening, this epiphany moment, and they just turn into a believer or they really struggle to sort of integrate this into their daily being, right? Because it's so far-fetched that they don't know what to do with this. For those people who can't who need to integrate this, I think a scientific path is a nice catalyst for them to make sense, to sort of embrace and embed their own experience into this bigger scientific picture, right?
Absolutely.
So I think that is one way I see. So first the kind of the experience, and then a rational explanation which justifies the experience almost, right? But I personally, I come, and this is just me, I come from a different perspective, right? I was just pursuing the scientific path without any sort of touch points with any kind of spiritual experiences, far from being awakened, right? Whatever. But it became so obvious to me that such an existence needs to be there, right? I mean, such a sort of what I call loosely information field, that something like that actually needs to exist, just as a scientific rational conclusion. And that then led me to become interested in finding these experiences, right? In sort of throwing myself into these kind of things. But without this justification, this upfront justification, I would have never sort of touched anything like wisdom traditions or any kind of spiritual things. So I needed the justification first. So the scientific path was almost like a door opener for me to get interested in all of the other things.
Yeah. Now, do you know about Federico Fellini, the Italian?
I've heard.
He is so originally from Italy, then he goes to Silicon Valley early in his career, and he ends up inventing the microprocessor, having all these startup companies making millions and millions of dollars. And what happens to him is when his co-computer programmers are talking about creating a computer that will be conscious, he's puzzled by that. He's like, can that really happen? And he explores it, and finally he decides there's no way you're going to make a computer conscious. It's absolutely impossible. And at that point, what he says happens, as an atheist, he begins having more questions. It's like, then what really is consciousness? And as he's trying to think about computers being consciousness, he then explores this more and more. And suddenly, in the middle of all of that, in the middle of the night, I think around Christmas vacation, when he's away with his family, he has this awakening where his heart explodes with all of this light and love flowing out of it. And he, of course, has that experience of oneness with the universe. And after that's over with, it's like everything has changed. He suddenly sees that, as the way he described it, I'm both a particle and a wave. I now understand how I can be both an individual and part of the whole. Yeah. And that then completely shifted the way he looked at everything in the world. And now he has started his own foundation related to doing research on consciousness because of that epiphany. So like you, it's like he was doing the research, and then suddenly there's a point where there's something wrong with making computers conscious.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I find this amazing, right? So it's almost like we are preparing the paths, right? And then once we have got enough preparation, then the universe basically kicks in, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So is this similar to your own life story? I mean, have you experienced something such as a sort of an awakening moment?
Yeah. So in fact, the reason I think I'm here talking to you right now is because toward the end, I've been a full professor now at the University of Oregon for like about 30 years. And then I decided that since I'd been a full professor and nobody can do anything about firing me, I'm going to go ahead now and write this book called Infinite Awareness, The Awakening of a Scientific Mind. And so I started writing that in the last few years. I was at the university about not only my awakening experience and then beginning to practice meditation, but then looking at consciousness and what is the nature of consciousness from all the research I could find as a neuroscientist, so that I could begin for myself to try to put those two worlds together. And what I should mention that I still had 2 graduate students as I was getting ready to retire when the book was about to come out. And I said, look, you may find that your professor has lost all credibility in the scientific world after this book comes out. I have no idea. And the humor is this. It's like, in fact, I have a textbook on rehabilitative medicine that's now in its 6th edition. It just came out. In fact, with my 2 students now being co-authors on it with another colleague. And no scientists seem to have actually read Infinite Awareness. They still think I'm very credible because they wouldn't touch a book like Infinite Awareness. So that's fine. But in the book, what I say happened is that I'm a young professor now, and my sister meditates, and she's actually following an Indian Swami, and she loves meditation. And for my birthday, she asks me if I'm willing to go to an intensive meditation program over the weekend to be with her and celebrate my birthday. And she'll give me this meditation retreat for free as a birthday present. And I'm intrigued because I've had a situation earlier, I think it was just like 6 months earlier at Christmas, when I was visiting my parents with my sister in Arizona, where I am now, by the way. And what happened was that there was a plane crash over Southern California that was in the news, where everybody died. And I'm frightened of flying in planes at that time. And so I have to get on the plane to go back home to Oregon, where I'm young postdoc. And she says to me, as she can see my fright, I have something that might help you. And I say, what? You know, I'm ready for anything. And she gives me this mantra, Soham, and she says, you need to breathe it in on the in-breath, out on the out-breath. And she says, that will help you. And so I'm desperate. I get on the plane and I start repeating it. And suddenly everything is different. I mean, I remember I'm usually like white knuckled on the takeoff of the plane, nothing. And I'm looking then out at the sky and the clouds like underneath us as I'm going home to Oregon, and I'm in ecstasy. It's like, wow. And so that was like just this opening of, wow, you know, maybe there's something that can work. So then when I go to this meditation retreat, the first thing that happens on the first day, you know, we're sitting on the floor, it's sort of Indian, darkened room, and they say the Swami is going to come around and initiate every individual there. And I'm thinking, look, I'm a scientist, initiate, you know, but anyway, I'm open, I'm curious, I'm going to put my skepticism aside. When he comes around, he touches me on the bridge of the nose between my eyes. And when he does that, I feel a current of electricity, like a mini lightning bolt, go from that place between my eyes down to the center of my chest, to what feels like my heart, and it begins like expanding outward, like this nectar, this love, this joy, and words come to mind. I'm home. My heart is my home. I finally found my home. And that's it. You know, it's like, then I go back home to my university position in Virginia, and I'm going, what on earth happened to me? Who is he? And what did he do? And that then, like, literally, I got up the next morning and I began meditating, and I've meditated ever since.
Wow.
And you know, and then there's that, as you say, it's the disconnect. The heart feels and knows something, and the intellect is saying, I don't understand.
Yes.
And so then the rest of your life is like, how do they interdigitate? How can both be true? So
I sometimes, when I speak about this, I sometimes use a metaphor of a bouncer or a doorkeeper, basically an intellectual bouncer who actually, doorkeeper, who actually sort of pushes the idea away, right? Because it's not on our radar. It's out of imagination, right? It's not imaginable. So and I think what we therefore do by carefully sort of putting it case by case or step by step and pulling more and more sort of rational explanation behind that, right? That this intellectual doorkeeper, the intellectual bouncer, sort of calms down, right? And sort of gets convinced step by step, so that he sort of opens up the door for you to also intellectually integrate your experiential kind of epiphany, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's very interesting to watch that happen and realize that, when I was actually reading all of these essays about other people and their awakenings and transformations, I also did a questionnaire because I'm a scientist and I wanted to get quantitative data from them.
Yeah.
And what most people said when I said, how long did it take you to understand and integrate that awakening? Many of them, in fact, probably the majority said, to this day, I don't completely understand it. And I'm still learning to understand it and integrate it into my life because, as you say, the intellect is so puzzled and most of us are very intellectually dominated. So it's fascinating to watch.
But the interesting thing here is I think that it's not the intellect per se from my point of view. I think it's more like how our intellect has been conditioned, because if we would have grown up in an ashram in India, such an experience would be immediately integrated, right? Because it's part of our worldview. That's the reason why I always talk about worldviews, right? I think we just, in the Western world, or I mean, this is generalization here, but in principle, in the Western world, we have been conditioned that these types of experiences are irrational. They can't be true. We are living in a materialistic world. All of these kind of things belong either to an esoteric kind of sect, or it belongs to sort of deep religious kind of beliefs, but it's certainly not to be integrated, right? And I think that brings me to the question of, okay, we have been conditioned, and that is part of our educational kind of background, right? So that's why I'm so fascinated to work with people like you and the Galileo Commission, but also like you probably are familiar with the Society of Scientific Exploration, where I'm working very closely with Bill Bankston on as the president. And so there are so many nice organizations where we now also find that scientists sort of open up for this new idea, right, of that the world might actually be different, right? But then we have got this huge time delay from, okay, it becomes now more and more scientifically acceptable because we get more and more statistically significant evidence, which actually cannot be ignored anymore. But then it's still a so long time it takes for that insight to then really reach mainstream understanding and mainstream knowledge, right? Yeah. So that is, I don't know, but someone told me it might take 40, 50 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing because, so maybe just taking a step aside for the moment, I was asked to give a talk at a Korean conference. It's coming up in about a month. And I just, in fact, they like you to record it in advance. So I recorded it with them in advance. And my talk, they wanted me to talk about a post-materialist society and what it would be like. And I said, well, first of all, I'm only a neuroscientist. I can't tell you much more than that. But what I ended up doing was, in a certain sense, talking about what you just mentioned right now. It's like, what would it take to change things to a post-materialist society where it was the whole program was also about the environment. How could we get our environment actually to one that's healthy for everyone in future generations by shifting to post-materialist perspectives? And the way I approached it is just what you're talking about right now, that worldview is the key issue. And my point in the conference from the other research I've been doing lately is that at least when I came into this world, I came in as a materialist, meaning that I had 5 senses that I relied on for me to understand reality. And those 5 senses limited my ability to really see what was out there. And on top of my 5 senses, I'm filtering all the information coming in. I also then had what we now know as this default mode network of the mind, which basically just lets your internal narrative run all of your perceptions as well. And so it's like we are programmed when we walk into this 3-dimensional reality as a child to be a materialist. And what we have to learn through culture or practice is to begin to turn down the filters so that we can see that broader interconnection and awareness. And so it's almost like we have a couple of strikes against us until we find ways within our culture and our own practices to begin to open up and sense the interconnection. And I think, one side of my brain talks out of my spiritual side and the other out of my materialist side. But, often I talk with friends about young souls, and I feel like young souls are the ones that are totally materialistically oriented, only seeing separation. And the older souls seem to have their filters a little bit lower down so they can see the interconnection, whatever an old soul versus young soul actually means. So.
Yeah, and this also, just to add this here, I think you will find also that there are old souls in young bodies, right? I mean, sometimes
absolutely
happens as well, right? So, but it's
really... a 2-year-old will be so wise.
Yeah, absolutely. But having you as a neuroscientist, I mean, so with your professional background, right, and you sort of dealing with consciousness, both from a scientific point of view, but still having had this awakening kind of moment, right? I mean, how would you tackle it from a scientific point of view today? I mean, how would you describe how consciousness works? How does it work? How does it relate to our neural networks and all these kind of things? Give me a sort of your take on that.
I mean, and here's the problem with that. It's like the reason why it's a hard question to answer is that all of the research that I have seen and now the papers that I have published show that you actually have to turn the brain down or off to get an awareness of this wider consciousness. So when you have the NDE, and this is like the best evidence for the survival of consciousness or consciousness being primary, you have a flatlined EEG. Mm-hmm. And any neuroscientist that tells you, well, you might have like some reptilian brainstem things going on that help you see things, your reptilian brain does not help you view the world. I mean, it's very primitive reflexes and things like that to keep your body going. So turning off the cortex, which is where you really perceive everything, and or the midbrain, is what we have in those situations. So for me, it's like consciousness doesn't need the brain, but when you're embodied, it uses the brain to understand reality, to perceive and interact with the vibrational things around it. And so that's the first thing. It's like, on the one hand, as a neuroscientist, I have to laugh and say, well, the brain isn't as interesting as I thought per se, because it's certainly not necessary. But what it would be nice to know is how, when the brain is active and awake and alive, how there is this transduction of this constant conscious energetic flow around us into the perceptions of our 5 senses and our experiences and feelings. What is going on in terms of that interface between the consciousness that is always there, that we can perceive without a body, and when we get back into the body, how does our brain now filter that information to allow us to see it within our current sort of worldview perspective, whatever we want to call it.
Yeah.
And I think that's hard. I mean, it's like, then you have all these theories. Is that the pineal gland? Is it the, I think a parietal, temporal parietal junction in the brain? They have all of these places where it might be where it like opens in, or some people say it's the dendrites on the surface of your brain. And I'm thinking, I mean, those are all possibilities. You could create hypotheses about each one. I'm not sure exactly how you're going to test that.
I think to me, one of the most interesting questions is more on a metaphorical kind of level. I mean, we could either, if we talk about the brain, I think I see 3 generic kind of ways to look at the brain. Either it is the source of consciousness, so it generates consciousness, or it's a kind of a receiver of consciousness, or it's a kind of filter. And so to me, I mean, I think we are probably clear that it's not, that consciousness is not generated by the brain. So I think that hypothesis for me, and again, I'm not claiming that I know it, but just for me, I've basically falsified it, right? So for me, the hypothesis that the brain generates consciousness is basically out of the way. So then I have still got 2 things. Either it's an antenna, so it's a receiver, or it is a filter. The thing about the receiver is I would imagine that if there would be more brain activity, then I would receive more, right? So that is the reason why I don't think it is a receiver either, right? Because what you've just said, if you have got an EEG flatline, right, then there should be no activity, and hence there should be nothing to receive, right? But it's just contrary. So that's the reason. And again, I'm not a neuroscientist, but just conceptually, that's the reason why I probably think that the most promising metaphor comparison might be that the brain is something such as a filter, that this overall consciousness does exist, and what we perceive is basically a filtered version of that overall consciousness. And
now here's just a question for you. Could I just maybe ask you to think about this? Being the neuroscientist that I am, reading all of the neuroscience papers, they have showed that if you stimulate any particular part of the brain, you can create an illusion of something happening. So it does generate things in its own way that are their own illusions. Maybe all of reality is illusion, but we also can modify our perception of reality depending on where we stimulate and how strong.
Yes, and I think and again, I don't want to sort of propagate that kind of picture, but I really enjoy sort of having these conversations with people who really know all of these scientific backgrounds. So the stimulation of the brain obviously has an impact on what we perceive. So, but that is like, you can change the filter. If you stimulate the brain, you basically sort of make the filter more transparent, right? So probably other things, additional things can then be perceived. I think the same thing would probably happen as an explanation when you get into different states of consciousness, that you all of a sudden have got a broader access. I mean, I'm coming from an IT, coming from a business background, but most of my career I've spent in information technology and in consultancy and around that area. So I'm using metaphors like access rights. So if our brain is something which actually determines the access rights that we have in terms of what we can access of that bigger consciousness, and what we perceive is what is already limited down through this filter of access rights that we have, right? And now you stimulate the brain, which is probably then sort of expanding the access rights, and you all of a sudden get an additional piece out of that bigger consciousness, which we declare as an illusion, but it's probably not an illusion.
Well, and it depends. So here's just the challenge to that.
Yeah.
So you are sitting in the room with me, and you have an electrode so you can stimulate some portion of my brain. And you can even do this with this transcortical stimulation, so you don't have to invade the brain. And I then say, oh my goodness, I see now in front of me this particular like thing over there in the environment, and it's clearly not there for anybody else, and it probably doesn't exist, because as soon as you turn it off, it goes away. Or I mean, the other thing that happens is that here's one that's another interesting one. That's the work that what is it? So it's a neurologist in Wilder Penfield. He's the one that was actually trying to get rid of epilepsy. And so he would actually try to get diseased parts of the brain. And he would find that when he would stimulate any part of the temporal lobe, these incredible visual memories that would go on for a long time would be activated. Now, then you can say, well, maybe you're taking off the filter that's keeping you from that Akashic record from way back. And now you've attached yourself to the Akashic record. But I think there are a lot of examples of being able to create in somebody's head illusions of sound by simply stimulating and you stimulate the tympanic membrane or different parts of the ear, and you can get an illusory sound that isn't real per se, but we've created. So it's nuanced, I think, is what I'm saying.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think this is exactly where I think this is exactly where we need to sort of get where we need to drive our understanding further, right? I mean, we need to really sort of get more clarity about this. And but what I find so fascinating is the fact that what you describe and what you talk about is for you just this is what you experience, right? I mean, this is what you see in labs, this is what you read about in papers, and so on, right? If I walk out of my house onto the street and tell someone about that, they actually look at me as if I would be nuts, right? And that is what I find so frustrating, right? So yeah, certainly we haven't got the entire kind of full understanding on how it all works. Perfect, but still that there is still, I'm tempted to call it an ignorance, but there is at least a huge sort of gap in terms of understanding what's currently happening in your labs and in the scientific research arena, right?
Oh, yeah, there is. And what can I say? I mean, I also find that when we look at the general public, more of the general public has had these experiences than people will admit because they're afraid of sharing their experiences with others for fear they will be thought that they are crazy.
Yes.
And that's one of the things we talk about in this book, is that most of these scientists did not share their experiences except with maybe a very intimate friend that they knew would be accepting. But even their family, often they wouldn't, because the family would say, hey, you're weak-minded, you're crazy, this is an illusion, forget it.
Yeah.
So in fact, I should mention that 3 of the people that contributed to this volume did it anonymously because they felt they wouldn't be accepted at their university if their fellow professors knew what they just wrote in that essay, which is sad.
But just, I mean, I'm all about sort of using that shift in perspective, that shift of the worldview, that new paradigm shift, the scientific revolution, however you would want to call it, right? I mean, there are multiple sort of labels you can attach to that, but to use this really to drive transformations, right? To drive transformations in personal well-being, to drive transformations in sort of social interactions, in business context, and so on and so on. And just imagine that insight that you've pulled together in the book and all of these sort of scientific metadata analysis and all of these kind of things, right? If that would become more common knowledge, then more people would be able to integrate their awakening experience into their daily life, and they would be more courageous to talk to their neighbors and friends about it, because they could just refer to your publications, right? Yeah. And then all of a sudden we would have, I don't know how many, what is the percentage of people who have had this experience? I haven't had, but anyhow, I know that there are a lot of them around, and a lot of them not talking about it, as you say. So imagine that we would now give them that helping hand by just offering them information that they can then use to justify that they are not crazy.
Yeah. And the only problem, of course, is, as you know, that family members and friends are willing to say that scientific evidence cannot be true, because we know the materialist worldview is true, and therefore anything you say against that doesn't work. And that's the frustration when you run up to those sorts of people that say, I don't care, it must have been a hallucination, or there must have been a problem with the experiment. And I have friends like that I've known all my life that are just hardcore atheists, and they look at me in a puzzled way when I tell them about the experiments. It's like, look, that's impossible. And so I think that's the odd thing that again, in this Korean conference, what I'm saying is that our worldviews are usually ones that we aren't even aware of, and they are very, very difficult to change, partly because we're not even aware of our worldviews.
Yes. And that is exactly, I mean, it's this, along the same lines when I'm working with leadership development. I mean, this is really like underlying assumptions which we don't challenge, right? And as I'm always using business language, I tell the business leaders then, okay, this is about due diligence. If you get into a transaction, if you would want to buy a company or you would want to make a big investment, right, there is always a due diligence phase. So there is diligent investigation going on. It's due to diligently investigate your assumptions, right? Because initially you make some assumptions about whether this transaction is good or not. And then you look into the books and you find, well, okay, some of the assumptions need to be revised. So it's actually, I think, again, using this terminology of the business like due diligence, I think what we need to do is we need to apply our own due diligence with regard to our own assumptions that we still hold true, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And you reminded me that I've written a few blogs on my website about what I also call the eye rolling threshold. I don't know if you have that in Europe, but in America, we talk about he rolled his eyes, meaning that you think it's so ridiculous, and about how each one of us has a different eye rolling threshold for paranormal phenomena. And I have the example of my own editor of my book that was helping me write the book, when I told her that Gary Schwartz at the University of Arizona had this soul, S-O-U-L phone foundation, where he was creating this ability to actually access spirits on the other side, and maybe your own grandmother who had died. And she rolled her eyes. It was like, that was well beyond her sense of the possible. Yes. And each one of us has a different threshold, but the more curious we become, the more we're willing to look at the data, as you're saying, to say, well, okay, I was rolling my eyes, but I'm now willing and curious to look at the data. And that happened to me as I was writing my book. I decided, I think it was because I had read Ed Kelly's first book, which was Say that again.
Sorry, no,
Irreducible Mind. Irreducible Mind is the one I'm thinking about. So
Irreducible
the University of Virginia group. And he had talked a little bit about Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation by Ian Stevenson. And I said, okay, I can't even believe, because I'm a neuroscientist and I understand genetics, that this is possible, but I'll read Ian Stevenson's work. And I came out of it saying, oh my goodness, it's like, this is unbelievable, all the evidence he has, and I shifted my awareness. But it was like, that's when you come in as a skeptic, but you're curious and you carefully look at the evidence, and then what can you say?
Yeah, and this, you see, I think the roll eyes threshold, you only sort of bump into this difficulty if the steps towards are too big. So if you make baby steps in terms of, okay, where do I start? All right. Take the first, how to eat an elephant, right? I mean, take the first slide, right? Yeah. And then you slice it further and further and further and further and further. And at some point, you eat the entire elephant, but you eat it in slices, right? And I think the difficulty we actually run into when we come to this rolling eyes threshold is that the chunks are too big. Yeah,
interesting.
Right? If we would give them smaller chunks, if we would give them smaller slices of the elephant, and if those slices would basically come in a logical sort of sequence, which allows them to sort of secure where they are right now, and then they eat the next slice, right? And then they feel secured there, and then they get the next slice and the next slice and the next slice. I think by doing that, by sort of reducing the amount of things that we throw at them initially and put it into a sort of a sequence which builds up gradually, right? I think that actually allows people to not run into this rolling eyes threshold.
Yeah, and I want to add one more thing to that, because I think that that is a beautiful way of dealing with it. And there's another factor that I'm aware of in myself, and I talk about again in this talk I'm giving, and that is fear. Because here is my understanding from watching myself. One thing I did not include in my book was anything about mediumship, because at that time in my scientific background, et cetera, there was a fear of mediumship because of having heard about exorcism and spirits taking over bodies and things like that. And that scared me. I mean, I thought that as an atheist scientist, I was safe because I did not believe in spirits taking over me. And so they never did. And so suddenly, if I opened myself up, I was almost afraid that something like that could happen and I wouldn't be able to control it. So I realized that when I talk to some atheists and some materialists, there's something about that as well. And part of it is like, they're afraid they're going to become crazy like me if they begin to open themselves up to meditation and things like that. And they see me as slightly crazy. I mean, I still remember I was previously married to somebody, he's a professor, they just retired from Harvard University. And when I told him I was meditating, and I told him a little bit, I said, why don't you at least come to the meditation center, this was in, Cambridge with me and see about meditation. And the look of fear in his eyes, it was like, not me, not me. And it's like he's going to be like grabbed by something and pulled into some illusion, and it frightens them to death. So there's a fascinating part of how you help them move step by step and get over the fear that this is going to somehow hurt them.
This just reminds me, I mean, my background is I'm a mechanical engineer, right? I'm a German mechanical engineer, which is really sort of, this is a hardcore materialist kind of background, right? Can't get really worse. But over the years, because I'm interested in these kind of things, I also sort of threw myself into shamanic education. So I've been working with a number of shamans, right? And the shamans would basically say that in this sort of, in this other existence, that there are energies which are sort of, some of them are friendly and some of them are less friendly, right? And part of that shamanic kind of education is also to learn how to deal with the not so friendly guys, right, out there. So this is just another, again, this is an educational thing, right? It's like, if we would want to take this fear away, there are also means to address that fear, but that is actually pretty sort of towards the advanced end of that curriculum, right? So this is not something which you start with, because most of the people that would immediately, they would run into the rolling eyes threshold there, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, as you're talking about just the continuum of knowledge and experience and where each one of us is along that continuum in terms of what we have experienced, what we understand, what we accept. Yeah.
Yes. And then from the moment or from the point where we are as of now, I think then is the question, how far can we stretch before we get into this rolling eye kind of thing, right? And this is almost like the stretch, right? Because if we count it in inches, right? I mean, how many inches is it from where I am right now? How many inches can you stretch with? Can you stretch me with the next slice of the elephant, right? Before I run into this rolling eye phenomenon, right? And I think it's an art. It's an art for us to find out, okay, where are you? And it's an art to find out, okay, how far can I stretch you? How big can the slice be that I'm now putting in front of you next, right? And that is the communication kind of art, and how we educate people. And I think depending on where the starting point is, and depending on their flexibility and their ability to stretch, if they have got quite an ability to stretch, you can put bigger slices in front of them, and they won't roll their eyes, right?
And here's something else I just want to add to the mix. To me, watching my own spiritual development, there was a second factor that we aren't talking about. And that is that no matter what my sister told me intellectually before I had that first experience with the plane, and then my second experience with the Swami and meditation, she couldn't have convinced me. My scientific worldview was so strong, but the experience is really what changed me. That I had an opening because of fear about the plane flight, and I tried something and it worked. And then I was curious in the meditation program, and unbeknownst to me, this was possible, that somebody could literally shift my awareness of my whole inner self and the universe around me. So it seems then that's the second part that's absolutely critical. They have to have an experience of it at that intuitive, deeper, energetic level. And then they go, oh my God, I had no idea.
Yes, and this is what I hear from so many people who have had that experience, that experience basically makes the entire thing so much more credible, right? It's just the way. And honestly, I've never had this kind of experience, but I'm still so much bought into.
But if you've studied with shamans, you must have had experiences of some sort like that, or shamanism wouldn't be of interest to you. Yeah,
but this is, you see, it was of interest because, I mean, I only got interested in shamanism once I had been convinced that all of these things need to exist. So for me, I'm a rare kind of example here, but for me, I've never had any kind of experience, any kind of awakening moment or any kind of things which actually sort of leveraged me onto this level of, okay, now I understand it and now I get it. For me, it was a purely sort of intellectual kind of rational conclusion, sequence of conclusions. And I was giving a speech at the first World Yoga Day a couple of years ago in Portugal, and there was a Swami from Calcutta who was there as well, and we just happened to sit next to each other in a bus when we actually visited Fatima, a pilgrim's place in Portugal. And on the way back, he was sitting next to me, and it's a 2.5 hours drive to get back to Lisbon from that place. And we had 2.5 hours of a really intense conversation. And at these days, I asked him, I said, okay, I don't know, I don't meditate, I don't do all of these things, but I still think that must be true. And he was just sort of looking at me and smiling, and then he explained something to me, and he explained to me that in yoga there are different types of paths. There is the
Jnana yoga,
yes,
the bhakti yoga, the karma yoga,
and the Raja yoga.
And the Raja, yes.
Yeah. So and he basically said all of the meditators are the Raja yoga guys, right? Because they would want to do this. All of the bhakti yoga are the devotional kind of people. All of the karma yoga are the good doers, and you are the jnana yoga type, right?
Yeah.
Which is path of knowledge. He was the person who first talked to me about those 4 different types. So I think there is this type. There is the type, the jhana yoga type, and jhana basically has the same sort of roots like gnosis, right? That is the Christian part of it. So that is this knowledge thing. And again, I mean, I don't know, but I'm speaking convincingly about all of that crap without having had a sort of an awakening experience or something like that. But I'm still very much convinced, right? I'm still, yes, now these days I'm chasing these kind of things, right? That's the reason why I'm getting shamanic educations and all these kind of things. I haven't touched any drugs. I haven't done any LSD or any kind of psilocybin or these kind.
Yeah, for some reason, I value my brain, and I'm not absolutely sure, because I've heard of people that have had real problems with the drugs, in addition to the wonderful stories, that I think I'll try it with other things. I mean, you know, so Federico Fellini used holotropic breath work and found that worked for him very well. And I'm intrigued by that as well. I mean, so some of these skills that one can learn through breathing, et cetera, are also seem to be ways of widening the perception.
Now that you're talking holotropic breath work, this is exactly the underlying foundation of something that I'm currently sort of experimenting with. And that is, it's known under the label quantum light breath, QLB, quantum light breath. And that is, has apparently been developed, whatever, by a gentleman called Cabal, but he cannot be the original source, because it just sort of, but he has sort of labeled it quantum light breath, and you can actually access videos and so on, which is a guided meditation which actually makes use of that deep breath kind of thing, and it's monitoring the breath. But it's the interesting thing here, he combines this with music in the background, and the music has got, so it's different speeds, right? And you sort of breathe according to the speed of the piece of music which runs in the background. And to me, because I have this affinity to music, I just like it and so on. For me, this is great, and it's a guided meditation which runs for 1 hour, and that is the most reliable one, which gets me into a sort of physiologically different state of body, if I may call it this way, right?
Yeah.
And that is what I really find fascinating. So I don't necessarily think, as you say, that we have to sort of swallow any pills or do any sort of substance kind of experiments. Probably, I mean, again, I'm running my own little sort of laboratory called my life, but probably at some point in time I will also get there. But so far I haven't.
Yeah, well, and I think that there are so many people that have meditated in so many traditions, whether it's Christian, Hindu, Sufi, whatever, indigenous, that have not used those drugs, in addition to those that have. So I think we must each have our own path, and that's fine. I mean, I should mention that there's a man named, I think it's Christopher, I want to say Bach, it's B-A-C-H-E, maybe or Bach, I'm not sure. He's from England, but he has done a lot of psilocybin, and he wrote one of the essays, and his psilocybin experiences are so phenomenal. They make you really, really, really want to take it on the one hand, and then I say, no, not for me. So it just the beings of light that he meets over there, and the love that he experiences, et cetera, that we've heard. And that's fine. And I've had, at least through meditation, other experiences that are at least very, very, what is the word, helpful for me in expanding my awareness. And
that's good enough for the moment, right?
Yeah, good enough for the moment, yes. Though I also should mention to you that, so when I was in this last IANS, International Association for Near-Death Studies spring symposium that we had, there were 2 people on the last day that were experts in out-of-body experiences. And one of them is from Germany, and I can't remember his name, but I can give it to you. And he's written a number of books. And the second one, who is, I believe, maybe from Brazil, I'm not sure, but said that he would be willing to give all of the presenters that were scientists now a workshop in out-of-body experiences if we all wanted to do it for free. And so I've signed up for it, and Jan Holden, our president, and a number of other people have, because I'm also intrigued by that ability of certain people to actually have the equivalent of a near-death experience where they're watching things from above. And I'm fascinated by how one can, in a certain sense, disengage from the 5 senses that are caging me inside of this perceptual awareness. So it'll be interesting to see if I have any ability to do that. I mean, I should say that being a scientist all my life, my intellect is very strong and my desire to be in control is very strong. And so I think it may be difficult to actually disengage from that. We'll
Yes,
see.
and that actually the desire to control is associated with fear, and fear is associated with a lack of trust, basically.
Yeah.
And
Interesting, isn't
I mean,
it? Yeah.
I think this is really the thing. So I think we are blocking these experiences ourselves, right? So because again, from this shamanic background, I think the question whether you have got an ability to experience these kind of things, any shaman would probably say everyone has got the ability. It's sort of inherited. We have that, but it's hidden. It's sort of, it needs to be developed. It needs to be unwrapped. It needs to be sort of made available again, right? But it's not that there is a from a shamanic point of view, it's not that there is a scarcity, that there is a lack of the ability. It's just the ability is sort of covered with a lot of different sort of belief systems, fears, old emotions, and so on. And what I found striking really when I got through this shamanic training is that they don't teach you specific kind of tool. I mean, yeah, they teach you some methodologies and so on, but in order to make use of these tools, the actual work that you do on yourself is to clean your own backyard, to clean up your fears, all of the emotions, old aggressions, old anxieties, all of these kind of things. And once that is out of the way, the more that gets out of the way, the more you get into your power there, right? And I find that really, really interesting. So it's that is also where I see the link to all of the psychological kind of work, right? Which we are doing. So at least the tradition, the traditions plural that I've looked at there from a shamanic background, they would probably claim it's not something that you lack. It's something that you already have, but you just need to tidy up so that you can access that.
That's interesting, because what Federico Fellini said to me when we had a conversation about this and his holotropic breath work, what he was using is Almas's diamond approach, which is something that's big in the United States anyway. And that's what the holotropic breathwork was doing. It was getting rid, it was helping you go back to your childhood and all these things that you had forgotten or suppressed that were blocking you from being free.
Yes.
And so it sounds very similar to that. And my own sense is that, I think that's why I want to do it, because I'm sure that my fears, my desire to control and my fears are based on those things, which I haven't been able to clean up. I don't know, my intellect doesn't know how to clean them up.
Yeah, and on that very topic, my intellect started to clean it up when I basically, for myself, concluded that something such as a bigger consciousness needs to exist, and that I am an integral part of that. That was the moment when I basically started to not entirely lose. I'm still sort of, I still have got fear and anxiety around death, but that was the moment when my rational mind basically really started to conclude that there must be indeed something after the decay of our physical body, right? And that, from my point of view, I mean, I've got an accreditation as a psychotherapist in Germany as well. So from that point of view, a lot of the fears that we are confronting ourselves with are existential fears, and existential fears means fear that we stop to exist, right? And that is mostly associated with death in our kind of culture, right? And or with sort of, I lose my job, hence I won't have anything to eat, hence I'm going to starve and I'm dying, right? I mean, this is this kind of weird, I mean, it's so far-fetched in our society, but anyhow, it's a kind of, that's what we do. But the most essential part of the fear is this existential fear of sort of dying. But as soon as you put this into a different context, as soon as you lose the fear of dying, right, then this cascades back into, okay, so why should I be afraid to do this? Because worst in quotation marks, worst thing that can happen is that I'm going to die. But by the way, that is not a bad deal anyhow.
You know, and so here's the funny thing, just about thinking about whatever my subconscious is like, because now having been a meditator for 45, 50 years, I'm very, very convinced at even an experiential level that going to the other side is fine. And, it's like, as I get older, I think, it's going to be okay. The suffering on the side might be somewhat difficult, but then you let go and there you are. There is a safety net on the other side of love, etc. So, and at the same time, I know that I have an incredible fear of what I call being separated from the herd, meaning the group of people that I consider my family. Some people use the term pod, something like that, and that I will be thrown out. And so my strategy from the time I was a little kid when I came into this world is please your teachers, please the people around you in such a way that they will love you and accept you. And I'm thinking, how is it that that still is so strong in me as a performer, that even though I don't feel there's a problem with the other side, but I can feel it in my heart. It's like I can get energetically, what's the word I want to use? Agitated as I'm trying to give like a really good present moment talk because of whether it will be accepted or not. And I'm thinking, my intellect says this is crazy. And then there's that fear that's like, well, can't we get rid of that fear? It's causing me issues.
Yeah, or it is part of still something you're meant to do during this lifetime, right? So yeah. Probably there is part of the job not yet done.
Yeah,
kind of
absolutely.
Aspect, right? Which can also be fine, right? And I think this is really when you start preparing for your own death, and you could, some people actually could start whatever in their mid-20s if they would want to, right? But yeah. Just imagine if you would be sort of mid-20s and you would be really able to let go, mm-hmm. Right? You would be fine to say, okay, I'm fine. There are no sort of things that I still need to sort of clarify with that person. There is no depth. There is no nothing, right? I have been really true and honest to everyone. So I'm 25 years old, and I could, if I'm now supposed to die tomorrow morning, I could let go. Just imagine if you would have that state of being, how you would be able to live your entire life.
Yeah.
That would be totally different from what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no question about it.
Yeah, and that is why I think, again, for me, it's almost like I'm passionate about the underlying opportunity here, and the chain of arguments is really like, okay, there is something such a scientific revolution going on. We find that consciousness plays a more fundamental role in the explanation of our reality. Hence, we are probably just an aspect of that consciousness. Hence, my identity can shift from being a limited Carsten to be I am the bigger mm-hmm. universe. Hence, my fear can go away. Existential fear can go away. Hence, I can live a far more relaxed life, and hence my ethical standards would change as well. So for me, it's like, these are just slices of the elephant, but if you put them into the right sequence, I find it a compelling story.
Yeah, it's true. And here is, again, my what's the word I want to make? My question or paradox about it. So all that you've said, I go, yes, yes, yes. And then I watch, and in situations, so here's one example. I took a mediumship course with Suzanne Giesemann, who is a well-known medium in the United States, that says she can help you access people, spirits on the other side. And part of this course was that every week you would go into a small group of about 6 or 7 of you, and you would all practice on each other. And could you see the grandmother, over the shoulder and hear what she had to say? I could not do that. And at one point, one of our members of my group was, she was well versed in this. And she said, if you'd like, those of you who are having trouble, I will try to look at you psychically and see if I can see what your blocks might be. And I said, of course, that's great. So she does that while I'm trying to do this. And she says, the problem is simply that your intellect is too strong and it's blocking you from experiencing these other things. And it's like, well, on the one hand, I know that, but my intellect doesn't know how to get rid of itself so that I can experience things. And now just to add to that, one humorous moment with Dean Radin. I don't know, do you know Dean Radin?
Yeah, I know Dean, certainly.
Yeah. Okay, so I was at a workshop with him where we were both giving talks at a conference in New Zealand. And in his workshop, he wanted to give us an experience of precognition. So he is saying, I'm going to put on the PowerPoint presentation, slides coming up. But before I put up the slide, I want you to go into a quiet state. We'll listen to some music and then draw what you think you're going to see on the slide. And so the first 2 times on the first 2 slides, I tried it. I tried to imagine what it might be, and nothing happened. I was always wrong. After that, I said, I'm just going to let my hand draw what it wants to draw. And then I'll see what happens. And then my hand was drawing something very similar to what was going on. So it was like, okay, in that case, we bypassed the intellect by letting the hand do what it wanted to do. And it happened. But again, there's no understanding of how it happened because it was beyond the intellect. And so it's a paradox. It's like, how does the intellect learn to get out of the way so that something can go on? That is,
I think what we call intellect is an accumulation of all of what we have learned and experienced. Because otherwise we wouldn't have gotten an intellectual kind of thing. So the intellect depends on our past, on our past, full stop. So the intellect basically is a result of our past, how we have been conditioned, how we have learned things, and so on and so on. So without the past, the intellect wouldn't exist. Right? It would be sort of, there would be no momentum, right? So, and I think that is exactly the moment when you learn to sort of switch off your attachment to the past. And you could really let go, if you could be sort of like a blank sheet of paper, right? And so and that's the way how you switch off your intellect, basically. And I think in these old wisdom traditions, this is exactly the reason why they do meditate, right? So if you put yourself really in a meditative state, and that is a state where you have that sort of connection, where you experience that sort of moment of awakening or enlightenment or whatsoever, however you would want to call it, and then you let your hand draw. I think then the accuracy is getting much, much higher. But the prerequisite is that you need to switch off your intellect. And hence, for me, it's not a paradox. For me, it makes a lot of sense. We just need to switch off the intellect, and meditation and other tools to alter consciousness help us to switch off the past and hence the intellect, and hence allow the as of now, the moment of now, to channel basically what's it into your hand. And then the hand can draw whatever will show up.
Well, you're right. And I think, as you said, that it sounds so simple to switch off the intellect. And of course, I've been meditating morning and night for all of these years. And here's another example, though, of one moment where, and a few moments where I've really discovered what you're talking about through, again, mantra. So in my own tradition, mantra is very traditional. And as one of these essays, Amit Goswami, I don't know that you know his name, but he was a quantum physicist at the University of Oregon. He talked in the essay about his awakening being deciding as an atheist, but from India, he was going to try repeating a mantra because he had a mantra from India. And after repeating it for 7 days solid, he suddenly had this epiphany where he becomes one with everything. And then everything is beautiful. His secretary, who he doesn't think is ever nice at all, was beautiful. Students were beautiful. So I thought, okay, I'll retry that in the last few weeks. And so every time I go out on the trail, and by the way, so I'm in Sedona, and again, there is Courthouse.
Oh, beautiful.
So I was going out there on my walk, and I just said, for the 45 minutes of my walk, I'm going to repeat this mantra, because I had been annoyed during my walks about the mountain bikers that were always on the trail making me move aside and things like that. And I'm just going to forget about it. I'm going to repeat my mantra. And what happened is that after repeating it for 30 minutes on the walk, a mountain biker came by, and we just did this beautiful dance of my moving or them moving with no thoughts at all, and just my mantra going on. And I realized that it was as if I had been drawn up almost like into a higher place of complete stillness, from which movement could happen in this interconnected way that was totally free of any suffering, any judgment, anything like that. It's like, that's where I want to be all the time. So, I mean, so it encourages me to keep repeating the mantra during the day, but it's interesting to think, how can I find those tools to get in that place you're talking about of total presence?
Yes. And it could be reciting mantras, it could be breath work, it could be plenty of things. And I think that is exactly I think it's a two-step approach. First, we need to understand that there is a whole variety of tools available in order to get into these different kind of states.
Yeah.
And then to find out what is the best tool for us at a given moment. I think that these are the two things. I mean, but only you need to make the first step first, because if you don't actually understand the underlying mechanics, right, and if you don't believe that there is anything, then you will never sort of search for the right tools.
That's right.
Yeah.
You know, I'm looking at the time and I'm realizing we're just on the hour 2, and my husband is making noises in the kitchen.
This is a good sign. It's a good sign. Hey, anyhow, this is great. We just need to expand this conversation at another point in time, right? But I'm so grateful for your time, also for the short notice, and I really appreciate that we've got that recorded. So that is.
Oh yeah, I mean, those are wonderful questions. I love the idea of conversations of discovery. So it's perfect.
Perfect.
Yeah, and I guess I'll see you tomorrow then on our next call as well.
Absolutely. So it's not going to be long before we see each other, and but we will certainly continue in whatever shape and form.
Great. Thank you so much, Carsten.
Worldview-Agility podcast. Many thanks for staying with us. If you have enjoyed this conversation, please feel free to recommend that podcast also to others. You can find all of our episodes on www.worldview-agility.com. Again, many thanks for listening and hope to see you again soon. All the best, yours, Carsten Ohrmann.